Hello everyone, this is Eisenherz again, and in today's video I want to share my thoughts on why I think that tier lists are only for fun, but power levels actually matter. So in the last few weeks I came across a bunch of gameplay videos from different content creators that featured Urza lists. And what I noticed with some, not all, but some of those lists, is that they were nowhere near to what I, and also my friends on the Urza server, would consider cEDH viable. Some of us actually reached out to the content creators to explain and discuss why we didn't think the lists were cEDH viable and how to improve them, but to no avail. They would either ignore our input or say something in the lines of, well, in my opinion, it's cEDH. So I thought to myself, Eisenherz, what even is cEDH? What is a cEDH viable commander? What is a cEDH viable strategy? What is a cEDH viable card? Are commander tier lists actually useful? And what, if anything, can we learn from them? So today I will try to answer these questions, sort my thoughts on the matter, and hopefully help you understand my perspective on cEDH. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first question we have to answer is, what the hell is even EDH or Commander? EDH is a 100-card singleton format that was created by a bunch of judges around 1996. Around 2011, EDH became Commander, as Wizards of the Coast made it an official format. But nonetheless, EDH or Commander was and still is meant to be a casual format that allows you to get away from competitive gameplay and metas. A format that allows you to play cards and strategies that would not be played in a competitive environment. As EDH was created by the players, for the players, and intended to be a casual format, it is not regulated by Wizards of the Coast itself, but by the Rules Committee. A group of players that try to keep the format healthy by banning or unbanning cards. They also adapt the rules if necessary. So, if EDH is intended to be a casual format where playing and exploring different cards and strategies in an environment that's explicitly not focused on winning the game, what the hell is cEDH then? To understand what cEDH is at its core, we have to take another step back. EDH is supposed to be a format that is enjoyable for those who play it. But enjoyable can mean a lot of different things for different people. The cEDH community consists of people who consider it fun to play EDH not against interesting, unique, or even janky decks, but against the strongest decks that can be built within the format of EDH. This means that cEDH is of course not a standalone format, and in my opinion it never should be, but it's a way of playing EDH. A way that EDH is maybe not intended to be by its creators, but that's nonetheless incredibly enjoyable and engaging. This approach doesn't mean cEDH isn't fun. On the contrary, it's incredibly fun. People are very friendly, and a big part of what's fun about it is the necessity to brew the optimal deck and make the optimal decision. Its MTG strategic side turned up to over 9,000. So even though cEDH players play to win, we enjoy these kind of games. We enjoy compact combos, fast plays, heavy interaction, stacks, well, maybe not stacks, but finding a way to win through stacks, and all the other things that make cEDH what it is. Okay, so cEDH players enjoy brewing and playing EDH in a competitive way. But what makes a strategy, a card, or a commander competitively viable? Can't just any deck be called cEDH if my goal is to win with it? First, let's make this clear. There is no hard cut between casual and competitive EDH. Power levels exist on a spectrum. You can of course play any deck with the mindset to win the game, but you will have more or less success with different strategies, commanders, and of course, at the core, different cards. The goal in cEDH is to build the optimal deck list and make the optimal piloting decision. So how do we assess if a commander, a strategy, or a card is competitively viable or not? Well, there is no cookie-cutter answer to this. Every card can be played in a casual list, and every commander can be built in a casual way. Most strategies can be powered down to be casually friendly, but not all strategies can be efficiently used in a typical cEDH environment. Let's start with examples for single cards. Remember, in cEDH we want to brew an optimal list, so we only want to play the best cards for a specific effect. Let's have a look at these two mana rocks. Mana Crypt and Sky Diamond. There is a clear discrepancy between these two cards. While Mana Crypt costs 0 and immediately gives you 2 colorless mana to accelerate like crazy and cast spells way ahead of curve, Sky Diamond costs 2 and comes into play tapped. The acceleration Sky Diamond provides is nowhere near to that of Mana Crypt. With Mana Crypt you can cast Urza on turn 2. With Sky Diamond you will maybe cast Urza on turn 3. See the difference here? With one card I have a huge impact on the game as early as turn 1 or 2. With the other I won't be doing anything substantial until turn 3 or maybe turn 4. At this point I'm 1 to 2 turns behind everyone else in my pot, and the game might actually even be over. Clearly, when compared to each other, Mana Crypt is much more competitively viable than Sky Diamond. Does that mean Sky Diamond can't be played in any cEDH list ever? No, of course not. But there are certainly better options, and there has to be a very specific reasoning behind playing such a slow mana rock. And budget can't be it. I'll address the budget issue later on. Now let's have a look at another example. These two black tutors, Demonic Tutor and Diabolic Tutor. Two sorceries, both unconditional tutors, but one costs 100% more than the other two. So when I want to add a tutor to my list, which one should I choose from a competitive point of view? Clearly Demonic Tutor, right? It allows me to tutor on turn 1 or 2 and have mana open to cast the spell I just tutored for, leaving my opponents no time to dig for an answer. Again, Diabolic Tutor could be played on some lists, but can never replace a Demonic Tutor, because Demonic Tutor does the same thing but for less in-game resources. Let's have a look at another example. Interaction and counter magic. In order to stop your opponents from winning, or in order to protect your own win con, you need some kind of counter magic or general interaction. When choosing counter magic for your list, you want it to be as cheap as possible, mana-wise of course, and as wide as possible. Let's have a look at the best counterspell that has ever been printed, Force of Will. This counterspell can be cast as early as turn 0 without the need of mana. It's basically free interaction and very wide, as it literally hits every spell. A casual counterpart for Force of Will would be something like Cancel. This spell also counters everything, but it costs 3 mana. There is no way of casting this without having mana open. When compared to each other, you can clearly see that Force of Will is the most competitive choice, because it's way more efficient. As a final example, let's address fetch and dual lands. Another big part of cEDH is mana fixing. Most decks are multicolored, because that will grant access to a bigger card pool and allow you to play the best cards from different colors. When piloting multicolored decks, it's crucial to have access to the right mana you need at all times. Otherwise, you will sit there doing nothing while your opponents further their game plan. Mana fixing is the foundation of multicolored cEDH lists. So how do we accomplish that in the most optimal way? Well, first you analyze how pips are distributed in your deck list, and then you create a land base that produces colored mana in the specific ratio for your deck. You can do that in a fairly casual way by playing only basic lands in the correct ratio. But that's not optimal, because you can't guarantee that you will draw the right lands reliably. Okay, so let's optimize it then, by adding fetch lands. These will allow me to grab just the right land for my deck. But what if I need a black mana now and a red mana in the next turn? Well, play dual lands, like the OG duals or the shock lands. These are fetchable, because they have basic land types, and fix mana way more efficient than basic lands ever could. Now, the thing is, casual players of course know of the importance of mana fixing, but they aren't pressured by 3 opponents who try to win the game, so they can approach the issue more slowly. Instead of fetch lands and dual lands, they might play Evolving Wilds and basics or triomes. This works, but it's way less efficient than using the fetch land plus dual land approach. See the difference? MTG allows us to do any one thing with different approaches, and some of those are much more efficient than others. And generally speaking, only the most efficient approach, the most efficient spells are considered to be cEDH viable. Okay, I have to play the most optimal version of any effect there is in order for my deck to be cEDH viable. Does that mean I can just make a cEDH deck with any commander? The short answer to this question is no, You can't just turn any commander into a cEDH viable decklist. The long answer is a bit more complex. For a commander to be cEDH viable, it has to provide value to your list and strategy in an impactful way. Generally speaking, that means the commander has to fulfill one of the following criteria. It has to create card advantage like Tymna or Thrasios. It has to be part of a compact game-winning combo like Godo or Iliad. It has to provide multiple layers of value like Urza or Kinnan. It has to enable compact game-ending lines like Cody. It has to stacks well or allow you to break parity on hard stacks pieces like, for example, Winota or Grand Arbiter. It has to give you access to lots of colors while also providing relevant value like Omnath Locus of Creation or Kenrith the Return King. Now, are these the only cEDH viable commanders? Of course not. But as I said earlier, competitiveness is a spectrum. So there are more cEDH viable commanders, but not all of them are on the same power level. When you look at commander tier lists, like this one I helped to maintain with my friend Max, you will notice that we try to implement multiple levels of competitiveness to represent the spectrum of competitiveness, and we orientate our decisions from the top down. We compare new commanders to the strongest commanders first and keep going down the levels or tiers in order to try and find the right slot for every new commander. Does that mean our tier list is the definite guide to cEDH commanders? Of course not. Keep in mind that we are just two random guys with different gameplay experiences and metas than you. We try our best to evaluate how strong a commander can be if brewed and piloted optimally. But at the end of the day, a tier list can never be anything more than an extremely vague guideline. In the right pot, any fringy commander can win games against the top tier commanders. But generally speaking, you will find more success overall with some commanders than with others. In conclusion, not every commander is competitively viable, no matter how much you optimize it, and also some commanders will be more competitive than others when brewed and piloted optimally. A tier list can be a useful point of reference, but should never be taken as a 100% objective and universally true resource. Okay, you have found a viable commander, and you know how to choose the most efficient spells. What's left? A strategy. The goal of any cEDH deck is to win the game. In MTG there are dozens of ways to accomplish that. You can use burn spells, you can use infect damage, you can use regular beatdown, you can mill your opponents, or use an alternate win con, like Test of Endurance. Although there are many different routes to success, in MTG, not all of those are cEDH viable. Let me explain. In EDH you play against 3 opponents. In order to win the game with regular combat damage, you will have to deal 100 damage total. In order to win the game by milling your opponents, you will have to mill around 270 cards. In order to win with infect damage, you will have to deal 30 damage with an infect creature. All of these routes are possible and will eventually lead to win, but they are inefficient. Just as with card choices, some strategies are more efficient than others. Overall, it is much more easy to assemble an infinite combo than to deal damage one by one or mill cards one by one. It's also much more efficient to assemble a you win the game combo such as Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation than to deal 120 damage with burn spells. Overall, you winning the game is much easier to pull off than your 3 opponents losing the game. A few examples of combo-centric decks are Urza and Iliad. Urza wins the game by assembling an infinite mana combo and dumping the mana into his activated ability to loop the library. Iliad is different in that it creates an infinite ping combo with Walking Ballista, dealing 1 damage to any target as often as necessary to win the game. Najeela is somewhat special. She can be used with some other cards to create infinite combat steps to win the game, but her ability to create an exponentially growing army of tokens makes her one of the few cEDH commanders that enable straightforward beatdown plans. Not all lists try to win by assembling a combo though. Some lists are focused around stopping your opponents from winning the game. These stack lists play multiple hate pieces such as Rule of Law, Archon of Emeria, and texting effects like Thalia, in order to disrupt their opponent's game plan and win through their own stacks effect. Grand Arbiter Augustine IV and Winota are prime examples for that. While Winota can create infinite combat steps and tokens, she doesn't need to. Stacking the board and snowballing into more and more creatures allow her to win with straightforward beatdown. Grand Arbiter is a much more dedicated stacks. Once it's able to stop anyone else from winning, it uses Helm of the Host to create more and more copies of itself to make the lock even harder on the opponents, and slowly but surely win the game with combat damage. Okay, let's now put all of this together. For a deck to be cEDH viable, it needs a competitively viable commander, a competitively viable strategy, and competitively viable card choices. The further your list diverges from what is generally accepted as optimal in any of those three categories, so commander, strategy, and card choices, the less competitively viable your deck will be. You can use Urza as a commander and build a combo-centric deck list, but if you replace competitively viable mana rocks with slower mana rocks and compact combos with worse combos, your deck becomes less and less efficient. You will move on the spectrum of competitiveness until at one point your deck can no longer be considered optimal or competitively viable. It might be competitive within a budget, or optimized within a budget, or within a strategy. It might be a high-powered deck still, but it will not be a 100% competitively viable list. You might now ask yourself, why is this important? Can't I just use my regular casual or somewhat tuned EDH list or budget cEDH list in a full-powered cEDH pot? And my answer to that might be harsh and controversial, but it's a very strict no. You can, but you definitely shouldn't, and there are multiple reasons for that. First, you do not want a cEDH deck in a casual pot, right? Because the cEDH deck will most likely ruin the gameplay experience for all other players. Within Rule 0 or the social contract of EDH, that would be considered disrespectful. Second, the same is true for an underpowered deck in a cEDH pot. Your deck not being able to have a significant impact on the game, be it with interaction, stacks, or by threatening a win, will inevitably ruin the pot's balance and consequently the gameplay experience for all other players. This doesn't mean that a fully tuned cEDH list can sometimes completely whiff. It definitely can, but if the reason you are not impacting the game is because your individual deck building choices make it impossible for you to keep up with the rest of the pot, you are responsible for creating an imbalance in the pot and not sticking to the social contract of cEDH. Third, in a competitive 1v1 scenario, that will usually not matter. The underpowered deck will most likely lose the game and things will move on. But in a 4-player game, it is crucial that every player has an impact on the game. If not, this will lead to one player significantly profiting off of the pot's imbalance and allow them to win more easily than in a full-powered cEDH pot. This can be considered unintentional kingmaking. Fourth, the issue of unpredictability. In competitive MTG, knowing the meta and how different decks work, or what cards and win cons they play, is one of the most important skills for a player. When I see an opponent on the first sliver as their commander, I can pivot my game plan in a way that allows me to deal with the deck, because I know it uses Food Chain and I know it can threaten a win with Thassa's Oracle at any time. I adapt to a meta or pot I know and can predict to a certain degree. If that first sliver deck suddenly turns out to be an underpowered sliver tribal deck, I might have just wasted my resources to deal with a deck or strategy that is not a threat to me or anyone else. Another example would be facing a mono blue deck that is unable to interact on the stack, because it plays no or only very inefficient counterspells. You expect the blue deck to be able to interact and play accordingly. If it can't because it's underpowered, that's an undesirable pot dynamic. So wait, rewind. cEDH decks are supposed to be predictable? Well, yes and no. Let's now talk about some of the drawbacks cEDH has when compared to casual or regular EDH. Casual or regular EDH is supposed to grant you more deck building freedom than you would have in a competitive setting. It allows you to explore different strategies and angles with new and interesting commanders. You can basically play whatever you want to. Opposed to that, playing MTG in a competitive way means that you can't just do whatever. You have to move within a certain framework of competitive cards, strategies, and commanders. This means that a lot of cEDH decks are pretty similar to each other. The best draw engines, the best interaction spells, the best tutors, the best mana rocks, etc. From a competitive point of view, not playing the best card for a certain effect isn't viable. So consequently, there is a growing list of cEDH staples and combos that can be found in a majority of deck lists. There are even staple lists, such as this one on Moxfield, that lists every cEDH card that is played in at least 10% of cEDH decks. If you brew a deck on Moxfield, you can even just quick add a list of staples to your list, because you will have to play most of them anyway. Consequently, this means that cEDH decks can be somewhat predictable, which is however a side effect of competitive gameplay in any MTG format, and not unique to cEDH. This also means that cEDH decks can be pretty uniform, maybe even uninteresting or uninspired at times. The 10th Grixis Turbonos deck will not look very different from the 9 that came before it. It will maybe differ in a handful of cards and have a commander with another form of utility, but at its core it will still be an ultra-efficient Grixis Turbonos deck, just as all the others, with mostly the same cards and strategy. In cEDH, uniqueness is not important though. Efficiency is the name of the game. Even if that means that every Dimir plus X list has to play Thassa's Oracle as a win con, and most decks consist of mostly staple cards. Uniformity, or the necessity to play certain cards for your deck to be fully powered, leads to the next issue with cEDH: accessibility and financial cost. I checked the cEDH decklist database, and most cEDH decklists will cost at least 1,500 euros, with the majority being around 5 to 15,000 euros. This is due to the high demand of extremely expensive cards, some of which are even on the reserve list, like Gaia's Cradle, Time Twister, or Mox Diamond. While you could just forego those cards and build a budget version of a list, that would mean you will have to power down your deck. Subsequently, cEDH will become a format that favors people with lots of financial resources, or veteran players who have owned all those cards for years. In other words, cEDH would become a pay-to-win format, but would just stop existing in its current form, because almost nobody would be able to afford a fully tuned list. Think Vintage. There is a reason Vintage is only played by a minority of MTG players. Almost nobody can afford a competitively viable Vintage decklist. So how do we solve this issue in cEDH? Easy, we proxy. The overwhelming majority of cEDH players is very proxy friendly, because the joy of cEDH games is the high level of gameplay. We want to play against good decks, good strategies, and good pilots, not against their bank account. The strongest card in cEDH should never be the credit card. I'm well aware of the fact that not every cEDH player is 100% proxy friendly, and not every LGS allows proxies, and I will address this in an upcoming video in more detail. But as it is, cEDH and the cEDH community could simply not exist in its current form without the widespread use of proxies, and because of that I highly recommend proxying whatever card you want, even basic lands. I, and most of us, don't care. It's much more important for a cEDH player to play against a fully tuned proxy deck than against a suboptimal no proxy deck. And keep in mind that cEDH is not a sanctioned format, so you can just proxy. Finally, let's address the last issue of cEDH: bans being made for casual gameplay environments. With every other MTG format, be it Legacy, Modern, Standard, or Pauper, bans are decided by Wizards of the Coast with the goal to create a diverse and healthy competitive environment. If a card or archetype becomes too dominant in the competitive meta, certain core cards will be banned to rebalance the meta. This can be a pain in the ass, especially when a deck you built and bought all the cards for is powered down in a way that makes it unplayable and the cards you invested money in are now almost worthless. But it's a necessary step for Wizards of the Coast to keep gameplay interesting and engaging. Otherwise, every format would be dominated by a certain archetype and a certain anti-archetype. With EDH, it's different though. Bans are not decided by Wizards, and not intended to balance competitive gameplay. They are decided by the rules committee, and they take a drastically different approach to bans. The RC wants to foster a certain gameplay experience that is healthy and enjoyable within the context of casual games. They want players to be able to sit down with random people at an event or LGS and have a positive experience. Therefore, the RC does not ban just overpowered or dominant cards, but cards that they think are not enjoyable and lead to a negative gameplay experience. A few examples would be cards like Upheaval, which is banned because it basically resets the game and can be frustrating to play against, or Caracas, which is banned because it's almost impossible to interact with and can easily lock commander-centric decks out of the game, which is something that the RC, of course, does not want. There are, of course, also cards that are banned because of how strong they are, like Griselbrand, Yawgmoth Bargain, or the Power 9, except Time Twister. But there has only ever been a single ban that was specifically made to rebalance the competitive meta, and that was Flash. Flash, or the archetype Flash Hulk, was such a dominant archetype that pods would literally consist of only Flash Hulk and very specific hate decks that were designed to disrupt Flash Hulk. However, the printing of Thassa's Oracle made it almost impossible to stop this deck, and in order to rebalance the cEDH meta, the RC decided to make an exception and ban Flash. That's it though. No other card was ever banned because of its impact on the competitive meta, while other cards have been banned because of their impact on the casual meta, and the result of that is a somewhat unhealthy cEDH meta. Cards that are only okayish in casual EDH dominate the competitive meta, while cards that are useful in competitive meta get banned because they ruin the gameplay experience for casual EDH players. The best example for that are Thassa's Oracle and Golos. Thassa's Oracle has become the most dominant force in cEDH since Flash was banned. Every deck that has access to blue and black is forced to play the combo of Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact, because not playing it, if you could, is deliberately suboptimal deck building, and that's a big no-no in cEDH. Golos, on the other hand, was a very strong cEDH commander, but not so dominant that it would warrant a ban. In casual EDH, however, Golos pretty much replaced all other 5-color commanders, and the RC decided to ban him in order to foster a more diverse gameplay experience. Personally, I see a lot of issues with this philosophy and strongly disagree with the RC's approach to bans. On one hand, cEDH will inevitably be broken by a single archetype in the future. If bans don't consider the competitive meta at all, the scene is already dominated by Thassa's Oracle and the meta's natural defense mechanism, Rule of Law. On the other hand, casual EDH can be incentivized to converse more actively before and after games, and to ban certain cards, combos, or archetypes by rule zeroing them. One of the biggest issues in casual EDH is that cards are too strong for their environment or used in an inefficient way, such as Hull Breacher. This leads to a bad gaming experience that could have been rule zeroed before or after the game. A measure that's possible in casual games, but impossible in competitive games. Enough about bans though. I will go into more detail about this issue in a future video. Let's summarize all of this now. In order to play competitive MTG, you will have to move in a certain, only loosely defined framework of competitively viable cards and strategies, as well as, in the case of EDH, commanders. Within that framework, there will be more or less successful decks. But the further you step away from the top of the competitive level, the less competitive your deck will be, until at one point it can no longer be considered competitively viable. This is important because in a competitive pod you agree to a social contract, and by not playing a competitively viable deck, you are actively unbalancing the pod's dynamic and thereby ruining the gameplay experience for other players. Finally, I want to emphasize that competitive EDH and casual or regular EDH are one and the same format that exist on a spectrum and are only different in their approach to brewing and playing. The same rules apply to both, and neither one is better than the other. They are enjoyable and fun for those who engage, and a more respectful interaction could help both ends of the spectrum. Especially because cEDH players do not want to dominate the format or the RC's decisions, but we want to be more involved in those decisions. On the other hand, casual EDH players can learn a lot about brewing from cEDH community and assess cards in a way that would help foster a healthy, casual meta. And with that, we come to an end. Thank you for watching my video. I tried to make it more visually interesting this time and added some music. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. I'm especially curious to see what you think about underpowered and so-called budget cEDH lists, as well as the relationship between casual and competitive EDH. And with that, I'm out. Thank you for listening.